Thanks, Jess.
Thanks, Jess. And I'm really grateful to be here with you today, Craig. Just for those who don't know me, my name's Luke Smith. I'm a neuropsychologist who works at M3CS with Craig and Jess and the team. And I was very excited to be able to be put in the chair to grill Craig today, given he's usually the one doing the grilling. Uh, um, but Craig, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, your wisdom with us today. What I'd really invite people to do is if you have any poignant questions or particular questions for Craig, please do put them in the Q&A and I'll be happy to read them out and go through them together. And today, Craig, we're going to be talking about stress and about mindfulness as well. But I thought maybe we could start off with, given the term stress is used so frequently in our community, I think it often means different things to different people, but I thought maybe we could all be on the same page. And I just wanted to ask you, a really basic level, what is stress? What is this stress thing we talk about?
Yeah, well, it's a widely used term, and sometimes it's a bit of a cover-all for feeling bad or feeling tense or anxious or angry or um, so it often in in common usage can mean a lot of things and be very imprecise. But when people try to define it, they use definitions like a perceived inability to cope. So there's some kind of demand coming at us. The demand looks big, and we see our resources as being small. So there's a kind of a mismatch.
Yeah, because you mentioned perceived there. I thought that was really interesting. You said a perceived inability to cope. What did you mean by that, Craig?
Well, the thing is that an event is an event. How we perceive the thing determines whether it's a stressor, a good thing, a bad thing. If a mouse ran under my desk right now, you could have a variety of responses. So if I see a monster, then I perceive it's huge and I'm going to be consumed by it. But if I was a 5-year-old child, I'd just see the mouse as a furry little creature, and I'd want to pick it up and pat it and take it home and feed it and have. It's not the mouse that determines the response; it's our perception, and that's been something that has been known for a long time. Epictetus, the ancient Greek philosopher, said, and they spoke in old-fashioned language, but it's the same for women as for men. But the saying goes, "Man's not disturbed by events, but by the view he takes of them." So the event, that perception of a mismatch, um, can trigger that stress response. So there's always the opportunity to recalibrate our perception, the way we see things.
So if we fast forward from ancient Greece to modern times, um, I guess modern conceptions of stress often talk about the fight flight response or the fight flight freeze response, I guess. Just from your point of view, what does that actually mean? Like, what's happening there? How does that relate to the mind?
Well, it's a pretty useful response. So if you're, walking through the bush and I don't know, a killer wombat comes out from behind a tree and it's about, 5 foot high at the shoulder and, I've never seen a wombat that big, but I mean, you can imagine, or you're stepping over a log and there's a snake that rears up. We have a fight or flight response within a split second, and it's not even a conscious decision. You just jump out of the way. So it's like an activation response. I often use a metaphor that, if you had a button on your dashboard, like a turbocharge button for your car, you put it into a completely different gear. And um, and the and we have a little turbocharge button in the brain called the amygdala. So you perceive something as threatening, um, that fires off and it starts to tell your body to pump out a whole lot of adrenaline and mobilize fuel reserves. And we can go into the details of that if you like, but just thinking of it as an activation response. So it revs your whole system, revs your engine to hopefully help us to either fight with the threat or to flee to get out of danger. So it's an adaptive and very good response. It's meant to be good for our health, stress response.
So it sounds like that there's these sort of ancient parts of our brain almost, our mind, where it really is developed to protect us from danger, such as a killer wombat or a or a slightly grumpy snake.
Yeah.
I guess my sort of question is though, is go what, we often when we hear about stress, we hear about the tiger outside the cave, or I like the killer wombat. I'm going to use that in the future, but
Mm.
What do you think the modern causes of our stress are, and how do you think that interacts with this danger response, this stress response that we have?
Well, the thing is, we don't see too many tigers and bears and lions and killer wombats and so on that really warrant that kind of response. And mind you, if you're walking across a road and a car goes through a red light, you need to jump out of the way. It's the same response, and you'll notice the effect within a split second. Your heart's going, you're breathing fast, and all of that happens. But the need for that is very, very rare these days in modern life. And But we activate it a lot more than we actually realize. So when we come back to perception, we can, I don't know, we're sitting there and in our mind we're thinking about 100 deadlines we've got and how am I going to get through all of this? And our mind is imagining, projecting into a future that hasn't happened, or maybe it's dredging up stuff from the past, an argument we had with somebody or something we said that was stupid we wish we hadn't said, and so on. We're all human, but your mind's playing a movie about the past or projecting into a future that hasn't happened yet. And and so based on that kind of movie we've got running in our mind, if we perceive that to be real, the body will translate that into a fight or flight response. So if we perceive it not only as real, but as threatening, the mind will activate the fight or flight as much as if there was a tiger actually there.
That's really interesting, Craig. So what you're saying is that there are these external causes of stress, such as jumping out of the way of a car that's, run a red light. But it sounds like what you're saying that this flight fight response, the stress response, can also be switched on by internal forms of stress, by the things that we imagine or think about in our mind.
Yeah, well, that's right. So like a lot of our viewers today would have perhaps seen the footage of Mick Fanning, the champion surfer, and the shark attack, and that 4 meter shark coming at him. And just in case you haven't seen it, spoiler alert, he got out of it.
That's good. Good to know.
Got out of it unscathed, and amazing footage. But in the press conference after that happened, what happened, Mick, was the first question, and his response was, I just went into fight or flight. So in that situation, adaptive and so on. But when we're doing this to ourselves again and again internally, and through imagining, worrying, ruminating, catastrophizing, etc., then we're activating that response unnecessarily. Now, maybe we do have a deadline and it desperately needs our attention, but from a mindfulness point of view, we get our attention on the job. We don't have to worry about steps 2, 3, 5, 10, 20. We need our attention on the step that's in front of us now. And if we can do that and focus better in the moment on what's in front of us now, we often find that stress response switches right down, but our focus improves and we find ourselves being more productive. But this distracted mode of mind, when we're unmindful, leaves us very vulnerable, not only to the emotional experience of stress, the tension and so on that we feel, the fear, the anxiety, etc., but it also the physiological effects, which can be unhelpful in the short term, but also particularly in the long term as well.
So those long-term effects of stress, you've spoken a bit about the short-term ones, about the immediate response to stress, such as jumping out of the way of a killer wombat or a car. But
Mm.
what are the longer-term effects when this flight-fight response is switched on more than it should be over a longer period of time? What do we see there?
Well, it produces a wear and tear on our system. So if you imagine getting the car and you're flogging the car, driving it harder than it needs to be driven all the time, we go through our fuel faster, so it keeps running out of petrol. Parts wear out faster, and the repair bills go up. It's a little bit like that with the body as well. So it's called allostatic load. It's a physiological wear and tear of overactivating this fight or flight system called the sympathetic nervous system. But the effects are many and varied. So we get this sort of activation of the cardiovascular system and the effects on, glucose and lipids and blood pressure and so on, the cortisol, has effects, including down to the bone. So if we're activating this cortisol, which is a part of the stress response all the time, we start to lose calcium out of our bones a lot quicker. So the bones age faster. We get immune dysregulation. So that means, it's one thing to activate your immune system to defend yourself when you've just been wrestling with a killer wombat, but it's not so helpful when we're activating that immune system again and again. So if there's an inflammatory condition, it pours fuel on that inflammatory fire, but also we get immune suppression. So we've got less defense against coughs and colds and infections and so on. Um, the effects on the brain as well. So these mediators of the stress response, when the brain cells are being marinated in that stuff all the time, then it has an effect of particularly losing brain cells, atrophy in two very important areas of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, so that's where all of our higher functions operate out of, our executive functions, so-called, and also the hippocampus, which is a kind of learning and memory center of the brain. And the only bit of the brain that grows is that stress center called the amygdala. So it gets big and it gets reactive. And just one other thing to mention, I mean, there are many that could be, but one other thing to mention is a lot of this adds up to things like increased risk of heart attacks and various things over the long term. But also it accelerates aging as measured by telomeres, which are little caps on the end of our chromosomes. So when we're activating this response all the time, those telomeres are shortening fast. So we're actually aging faster down to the DNA of our cells.
It's interesting you say that because I was just reflecting on, the lived experience of stress, and I was thinking of my own experience or even just my mates in my life. It's not unusual that when you go on holiday and you've had a really, busy time at work and in life, suddenly you just get a cold or a flu or you get something, sort of that almost like your immune system is just worn out a bit. I know that when I'm stressed, often I'm a bit foggier cognitively, mentally. I'm just not as sharp. Sometimes I'll make mistakes and not remember things. But I find it also interesting that comment about telling me is because it's not unusual that when someone's been through a stressful time, they might say, geez, I feel like I've aged another 10 years. So
Mm.
it's interesting how the kind of real life experience or expressions people have does match up a bit with the sort of science they're talking about there.
Well, that's right. That's right. So, and I mean, mostly we know this stuff ourselves intuitively,
Mm.
even before the science sort of caught up to it. But we know if we get very run down and very stressed over a period of time, especially when it affects other things like sleep as well, then it has this cumulative effect. Now, I've been giving a whole lot of bad news, and I think that probably most of the people watching the webinar today are feeling pretty stressed, anxious, and depressed about what I've just been saying. So, if I could
Don't
give
leave,
good,
everybody. Don't leave. Stick around and listen.
well, if I can give some good news, and the good news is that these are all reversible effects. The ones on the brain, the ones on the cardiovascular system, metabolism, immunity, and even on the DNA. If we learn to recognize and switch off the unnecessary activation of the response. So that for every one tiger we do see, we've got probably another 999 up here. If we can just start to see those imaginary tigers for what they are, then the stress response will switch itself off. This I notice for myself. Sometimes speak about formative experiences I had in my own life.
Yeah.
And when I used to, a lot of competitive sport when I was growing up, particularly competitive swimming, and in weeks prior to big swimming meets, I'd often get very nervous. The old Olympic pool in Melbourne, stands are full, and it was just like I used to get very nervous about that kind of thing until one day I recognized I was feeling nervous on a Saturday morning sitting at home. And all of a sudden I realized I was sitting in a very comfortable chair in my lounge room with wattle birds singing outside and the lemon-scented gum tree we had in our front lawn. And all of a sudden I had a reality check. I'm feeling all like this, all a bit queasy in the stomach, and I realized I'm actually in a really lovely environment. And I realized that in my mind, there was an imaginary me standing on the imaginary starting blocks, waiting for the imaginary gun to go, imagining myself hitting that water really cold. I got to tell you, they did not heat that pool in there. And it was like, all of a sudden, I realized I was in a dream world. And I wondered how much of the time I was in that dream world.
How often do you think we are in that dream world, Craig? Because,
Hmm.
you've been talking about this sort of imaginary even though stress can be real, our perception of it, how we filter it through our mind, how often do you think we are distracted by thoughts about the future or remembering the past or fantasies about how we want things to be different?
It's really hard to be sure. The best estimate was from a research done at Harvard University. They estimated probably at least 50% of the time our minds are away with the bird somewhere else, not present. And worrying about the future, thinking about but out of touch with what we're doing now.
Yeah.
And and so that means 50% of the time, probably at least, and probably more at other times when we're particularly stressed, the mind's distracted and we leave ourselves very vulnerable. Because I noticed for myself, as soon as I brought my attention back to the present moment and actually where I was, like through the senses, looking, feeling, hearing, smelling, all of a sudden I noticed that stress response switched itself off. And this is kind of, for me, although I didn't have the language for it, it was a kind of a very much a mindful moment. And I kind of realized, well, if we're not mindful, I could feel it in my body and it didn't feel good. And so I think that this is kind of one of the things that really important from a mindfulness perspective, that how it helps us to manage stress. And it doesn't mean that there isn't a challenge in front of us, but as soon as we engage our attention more fully on what's in front of us, it often goes from being this to being this. I mean, it is a challenge, it's difficult, something we've got to work through. But also what happens is our sense of our capacities go from this to this.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden we've got a greater capacity to use the intelligence, use the energy that we have to deal with the challenges. And that's a win-win situation.
Well, I find it interesting though, Craig, you mentioned that, on reflection, when you were sitting there standing at the starting blocks in your mind with all the disasters about to ensue in the cold Arctic water of swimming competition, you noticed that, you noticed this propensity of your mind doing that, and you brought yourself back. But you said also this is before you really knew what mindfulness was or was practicing mindfulness, fully. I find that really interesting because we'll delve into hopefully mindfulness a little bit more today, but you know, mindfulness is often thought about as a new skill you have to learn or a new program you have to learn. But what you're saying is that you kind of had some of that before even really knowing what mindfulness was.
Yeah, I think we all have mindful moments. We all have these sort of learning opportunities, but we don't often enough actually acknowledge them. And oh, what's the lesson there? We just kind of, oh yeah, that's interesting, and just move on. And but for me, I certainly found those little moments of insight. I sometimes say a bit tongue in cheek about every 10 or 15 years we have a useful thought, but people think I'm joking, but seriously, about every 10 or 15 years, I think we have moments of insight. And
I'll have to make sure we bring a cake for you on that day, Craig, when that does happen. It's
that's
just meant to.
right. Well, I've
Um,
not found that I've known when they're coming up, but so you'll just have to have a cake ready the whole time
yeah.
so that if I have it. But uh, but these moments of insight, to actually acknowledge them, we can actually learn a lot because when teaching mindfulness, often asking people those questions, inquiring into people's experience, their experience has actually shown them the same things, but maybe just haven't really acknowledged them. And so I think that the really important learning comes from inside ourselves to actually realize that we've got a lot more wisdom than we actually know.
So it sounds like um, that this component of ourselves, of our mind, is innate. This ability to be present, to be fully immersed in the moment, the wisdom or the insights that we gain from doing that. And I know that probably a lot of people in our audience will be more au fait with mindfulness than the general public. But I thought just because we keep using this term again, just in case anyone has less experience or less knowledge about mindfulness, and I'm probably assuming this is the 1.2 millionth time you've been asked this question in your life, Craig, but what is this mindfulness thing that we're talking about? What is it?
Well, I don't. I mean, there's a very widely used definition, often given by John Kabat-Zinn. The awareness that grows from being in the moment, paying attention unconditionally. It's and that's not a precise wording of it, but along those lines. I tend to say that mindfulness is about being present and aware in the moment. And not just of what's going on around us, but also what's going on within us as well, because the two are in constant communication with each other. So it's that awareness um, in the moment, in the present moment. And when we're practicing mindfulness, we're practicing two main things. So the first one is attention. We're practicing paying attention, like consciously, deliberately, intentionally paying attention to the moment. And the second thing is when we're paying attention in a mindful way, we're paying attention with a particular attitude. So attention and attitude. And the attitude bit is a kind of one of openness, of curiosity, of gentleness, of a kind of non-reactivity. And that attitude matters a lot because when we start to practice mindfulness, we discover how distracted the mind is most of the time. But if we can notice that in a non-judgmental, non-reactive kind of way, we don't elaborate on, oh, why am I so distracted, and get even more distracted with an internal conversation about why am I so distracted. Um, but it also, when we're experiencing something uncomfortable, and I discovered this for myself as well when, studying medicine and you have some pretty interesting and challenging moments, and as things you have to sort of learn to deal with. And I kind of realized for myself, if I could experience those feelings of aversion and discomfort and stress, but if I could just learn to be at peace with them, learn to notice them without being reactive to them, I didn't get into a cycle of escalating them. So if I could just notice them in that kind of gentle way, then they just sort of ebbed and flowed by themselves and just settled by themselves. The paradox was, it wasn't about trying to do something to make it go away. It was just learning to be with it in a more comfortable kind of way. So I've expanded on my answer probably too much, but the two main things are attention and attitude.
I think that's why you're here, Craig, is to expand on things. That's so you don't need to apologize for that. It is interesting. I was reflecting on what you're saying, how it's really natural to have thoughts pop up in our head, to experience emotions, and sometimes that's purposeful, sometimes that's not. But it is interesting how you can have a thought about a thought about a thought about a thought, or you can feel anxious about being anxious and then be anxious about how often you become anxious about being anxious. And then you kind of go down that rabbit hole, right? Which we were talking about before, where even though you might be sitting at your desk doing some work, or you might be watching a television show, suddenly where your mind is nowhere near where the present moment is where you are.
Mm.
We've talked a bit about stress, and I'm really grateful that you sort of touched on mindfulness. I really love that idea of it's not just about the attention training, it's also the attitude we bring to when we're trying to be mindful. But how does this work with stress? How does this ability that sounds like it's relatively innate within us, how do we harness that? How do we cultivate mindfulness to try and help manage our stress better, often in our very busy, often technologically complex lives? How do we do that?
Well, again, the how does it help with stress? Well, if we are dealing with challenging situations that need our attention, from mindfulness point of view, engage, lean into it. We have this desire to pull away, no, 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 ignore, procrastinate, avoid, distract. But if it is something that needs attention, then to give it the attention it deserves. That helps with stress and also helps us to cope better with the challenges of life. But also the kind of stress that we generate for ourselves. I can remember it was the night before the first keynote address that I'd ever given at a conference. And I don't know if anybody else on this call today has a fear of public speaking, but that was my number one fear in life.
You're hiding it well, Craig.
I probably would have rather been eaten by a shark than speak in public. And anyway, but I was interested in how to manage stress myself and teaching students about that and patients and so on. So anyway, eventually gets to the point where somebody at the conference says, would you speak about stress management and using mindfulness to help? And it was the night before the conference. I sometimes tell the story as I was washing the dishes, and washing the glasses actually at the time. And as I'm washing them, I'm kind of doing it on automatic pilot while I'm feeling a bit nervous and a bit apprehensive about tomorrow. And I thought, oh, gee, how and I can remember thinking to myself, oh, I hope I'm in the present moment tomorrow. And all of a sudden, I had a moment of kind of waking up. How ridiculous to want to be in the present moment tomorrow.
Yeah.
I'm not going to find out till tomorrow.
Just put it in your diary to be in the present moment tomorrow morning. Is that right?
Yeah. But all of a sudden, it became blindingly obvious to me if I want to have any chance of being in the present moment tomorrow, I should practice being in the present moment now, which meant to give my attention back to the glasses I was washing, the dish mop, the water. So to come back to the sensory, like literally come to our senses, come back to the actual experience of the moment. And a number of things happened, like the glasses getting washed better than they were before, I suspect. But I noticed a few moments later that stress response had switched itself off. Not because I was trying to relax, but just because my attention had shifted back to the present moment. There was no tiger in the kitchen or anything else. There was just some dishwater, etc. So in terms of how does mindfulness help? By coming back to reality and seeing the present moment as nothing more and nothing less than what it is. If we come back to the present moment, yep, that is a tiger. Fine. Fight, fly, say
Deal
your
with the tiger.
prayers, whatever. So that's the main way. Physically, mentally, just coming back to reality. Mindfulness is not an escape from reality or an avoidance of it, quite the opposite. But so often we experience the present moment filtered through, distorted by all sorts of stuff going on in our heads. It's called the default mode network, which has some really, really useful roles to play if it's used well. But if this default mode network is running off by ourselves and we're living in this sort of parallel universe in our heads, it's often full of fears and anticipation and everything else that that generates huge amounts of stress.
It's interesting, Craig. I just wanted to come back to a point before when you talked about washing the dishes, and noticing your future fears or catastrophizing about the talk you had to do the next day. Last week when I was putting a talk together, I went into clip art on PowerPoint, and I typed in mindfulness or meditation, and all I got were these pictures of people sitting in their Lululemon, their perfect athleisure wear, looking like models, sitting on a beach with the sun going down in some perfect, meditation pose. But yet you were talking about being mindful doing the dishes. I can tell you when I looked at those clip arts, there was no one doing the dishes when I typed in mindfulness or meditation. Can you extend on that a little bit? Because I don't know, that's really interesting to me that this idea that you don't have to wait to be mindful, you can actually be mindful right now.
No, and the reason we sit down to practice meditation is not to have a time out in hellish thing, just go back to business as usual. The reason we do that is to have a better chance of being mindful in our day-to-day life. So long before I ever took up meditation as a regular practice, as a junior doctor, I remember mindful moments doing my first lumbar puncture. Very long needles, and you're putting them into,
Can I say on behalf of your first patient, thank you for practicing mindfulness when you were doing that?
So, and I can remember thinking, there's only one place my attention needs to be right now, and that is on feeling the needle, looking at the alignment, because if my attention's on catastrophizing and worrying, then I'm not in touch with what I'm doing. And I can remember making conscious decisions to be in touch, to, but also dealing with the workload, doing very, very long shifts.
Mm.
And I'm talking going days at a time without any sleep and without stopping. Um, and I can remember like that, and those kinds of shifts are not legal anymore, but they were when I went through as an intern. And I
Mm.
realized that the day, even though you might have gone 24 hours, 48, 64 hours with a longer shift without a break, the day was full of opportunities for mental rest. So again, being mindful, walking from one ward to another, a 2-minute walk to see another sick patient in the middle of the night was 2 minutes of mental rest. Just walk. Just keep simple moments simple. So for me, I much rather think of mindfulness as a way of life, as opportunities to be mindful 24 hours of the day. How do we get better at being mindful in day-to-day life? We sit down and take the attention circuits of our brain to the gym for a few minutes each day, and practice some mindfulness meditation. So the meditation is there to serve, to facilitate our lives and so on, our engagement with life. It's not a it's not seen as, something separate to life.
It's interesting when you said before that despite the really hectic schedule you had as a junior doctor, there were moments for mental rest. There was moments to bring your attention back to the present moment. One of the questions that I often get when I am talking to people about stress management and mindfulness is some people do have a fear that, for lack of a better term, using mindfulness, they'll just get so chilled out. They'll get so zen that they just couldn't be bothered doing things anymore. A lot of people, I think, associate being driven and achieving goals and being successful with this constant kind of internal drive all the time to do more and to which is ironic given that we often achieve the goal and then we just want to achieve the next goal. But what would you say to someone if they were a bit fearful that if they started practicing mindfulness, maybe they'd become too chilled out, too zen, and lose that drive, lose that motivation in their life?
Well, I think, look, I'll speak from my own experience and I can speak from the research as well. That when we're more mindful, we're not being so motivated by stress. Because so much of this sort of driving performance is about stress. How will I go? What I got to do? What we have the opportunity to be more motivated by is what we're interested in, what we're passionate about. And it's like one of the studies that looked at how come people who are more mindful seem to have less of these what they call action crises. So, you reach difficult junctures in project life, work, career, and how do we deal with the difficulties? Do we get kind of skittled by them, or are we able to work through them?
Mm.
I found that people who are more mindful had less of these action crises for two main reasons: much more in touch with intrinsic motivation, like why you're doing what you're doing. And if we keep our view big of the things we're passionate about, the things we're interested in, contribution we want to make, helping people, whatever it might be, if that view is big, then we navigate through those ups and downs better. And the second thing was the ability to manage difficult emotions. Because just because we do a bit of mindfulness doesn't mean, well, I don't, experience uncomfortable emotions anymore. They're just a thing. They may well come up because we're all human. But the ability not to be controlled by those emotions. So what we're talking about before, the ability to notice, be non-reactive to them. So those emotions come up, but rather than being controlled by the emotions, we learn that we don't have to be controlled by them. We're not trying to suppress them. We just don't have to be controlled by those emotions and reactions. And that gives us much more ability to engage and persevere and be patient and work through those challenges. So I actually find it's the opposite. Um, and but we're just more likely to replace stress as our prime motivator. And stress is better than apathy. We're going to get a lot more done if we use stress compared to apathy. But we should not confuse that sense of being calm or more relaxed that can come with mindfulness with that sort of relaxation that is just apathy, put the feet up, who cares, whatever. And that's not necessarily going to be a very fulfilling or productive life.
So it sounds like people's fear about becoming apathetic or becoming unmotivated, it's more that it's just being aware of the type of motivation you're experiencing, whether it's a one that is meaningful, one that it comes from you with a broader sort of sense of what's going on, or whether it's that really stressed, hectic kind of drivenness that we can all have together.
And that's one of the things that you see in so many outstanding athletes. You mentioned Kathy Freeman before, and we'll be talking with her next week in the monthly seminar series. But people like Ash Barty and the women's cricket team, so many elite athletes, so many Brownlow medalists, and being a Richmond supporter, there's
Talk
a
about
few.
stress, Craig.
Yeah, but these people who practice these skills actually find that their performance goes to another level, but they're being driven by the thing that they love rather than fear and anxiety, which often comes when we're in our less mindful moments.
So it sounds like through cultivating mindfulness, it isn't just about training attention, although that's important, and getting to know yourself a bit more. It sounds like they enjoy it. They enjoy the
Yeah.
experience a little bit more because it's not driven by this fear or this sort of stressful response.
Yeah, some of the research has shown that, oh, you practice mindfulness, you wind up with less motivation than if you don't. But the same research finds that people perform better as well. Perform better, but got less motivation. That
Mm,
doesn't make sense.
mm,
When you look at how they measure motivations and the assumptions that are made about it, it does make sense because mostly arousal, another way of saying stress, and future focus. How am I going to go? Will I pass? Will I fail?
mm,
Etc. What does mindfulness do? Helps a person to feel calmer, that is less arousal, and be less focused on the future. Why? Because just more focused on the present moment process. So better performance, but feel better at the same time. So that's not a lack of motivation. It's just the person's not having to use stress and worry about the future as their motivator.
Well, Craig, I'm really, really grateful for all your reflections. And I'll be honest with you, I could do this for another 5 hours, probably while people are starting to look at their watches with you. I'm
Yeah.
just aware that we do want to leave some time for questions today.
Mm.
Um, so I just wanted to say a massive thank you for all your wisdom. Even though I've been working with you for, 4 or 5 years, I always think that I've learned as much as I can from you, but I'm realizing more and more that these opportunities, I'm just learning so much more from you, Craig. So thank you so much.
I think you're
Um, welcome back, Jess.
Hey, that was great. I could as well. It's true. We work with Craig every day, and yet there's all these new and inspiring bits of wisdom we get. So I'll just bottle it. Well, good we're recording it, isn't it? We've got a few questions. So I'm going to start with these ones are they're really good. They're looking, I guess, for tips here. One from our audience. I really struggle to focus when highly stressed, which in turn affects my sleep, homework, work commitments. Life, it just becomes really over stressful.
Mm.
Um, so, and then even then the exercise, so it sounds like they're in a state of freeze. So where do they start to get out of that?
Mm. Well, it's most most challenging to all of a sudden switch into mindfulness in the midst of, you know, crisis moments, especially when we haven't been practicing it regularly before. So I think the thing to do is not to see it as just something to bring out when everything's hitting the fan, more to see it as something to practice on easy days and more challenging days and very so to actually see it as a regular practice. It's like if somebody said, "Oh, today you've got to run a marathon." Oh, I should start training. It's like, whoa. So we want to put in the training on all the days, even when we don't need to run that marathon, so that is there when we do need it. But the thing, often when we're most stressed and pressured, is we think, I don't have time to do this. And it's exactly when we need it the most. So often we're rushing around. And the first thing we need to do is to start by stopping. Just take a moment to just feel comfortable, to learn to feel comfortable with the feelings we're having. It's okay to be a human being having a human moment. It's okay. So if we can just soften the attitude to it, we've got 1,000 things on our plate. Maybe we can just say, all right, well, what's priority one? Just come back to priority one, focus on that. I don't have to worry about priority number 30. I just need to one step, one moment, one job at a time. So if we do a bit of practice bit by bit, then when those moments come, then we have a little bit more of the wherewithal to bring some mindfulness to that. But we're not trying to make those feelings go away, but we can learn to develop a little bit of an ability to, get a step or two back from them and to not necessarily be so controlled by those feelings. But look, with very challenging emotions, this doesn't just happen in a flash. We work up to to being able to deal with those. And we might surprise ourselves 6 months, 12 months down the track of what was seemed insurmountable all of a sudden starts to become much more manageable. So lots of room for encouragement there. So to whoever questioned that was, because I know how that feel.
Yeah, I think we can all relate. Um, Kieran here has asked a great one. So, is the very moment I become aware that I'm stressed, so noticing a tightness in the stomach or rising body temperature, increased heart rate, um, the moment when the stress response begins to settle, if I stay with those sensations with awareness, am I doing something right, or is it just being in a state of being? So is that
Yeah.
yeah.
Hmm. Well, if we notice, like those feelings can be running around the body and the mind can be distracted and catastrophizing, and we're oblivious to it. So the moment we notice our state of mind and body, that's a moment of mindfulness to notice it. Now, what do we do next? Well, it depends on the situation or the context. I can remember I mentioned before, fear of public speaking and so on. I can remember one time I was at quite a big event, and it was over a dinner, and I was the guest speaker at dinner, and I was just eating some dinner, and the person who was leading the event, leaned over and said, "Oh, uh, we'll start in a moment. You're ready to go." And all of a sudden, it's all ancient, the heart started going, and the throat and the diaphragm, and he's getting up, and he's starting to introduce me, and I'm having these feelings, and it's like, and I'm very conscious of them. In fact, I'm fixated on them, and I think, quick, practice mindfulness. Hurry, I haven't got long, and I'm trying to practice mindfulness, and this is going up. And all of a sudden, I had a moment to just, whoa, 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 stop. I thought I was practicing mindfulness when I was practicing the opposite of mindfulness. I was practicing it in order to make this stuff go away. And all of a sudden, I just, come on, get back to basics. Two things: attention and attitude. So the first thing was the attitude. These feelings there, just let them be there. It's okay. Don't have to get rid of, just let them be there. Just be aware of them and just let them flow in and flow through. So I stopped fighting with them, reacting to them, and just notice them as sensations. So just change the attitude 180 degrees. The second thing was attention. My attention was fixated on myself, and I kind of thought, if this person's up there introducing me, probably helpful to pay attention to what he's saying. So, so I just kind of let those feelings be there and gently unhooked my attention and listened to what he was saying. I saw him there, standing there, heard what he was saying. And as he was saying something, I thought, oh, that's interesting. I could, just riff off that when I, first get up and so on. So all of a sudden I got listen. And and the next thing I noticed that this stress response was switching itself off by itself. It was just down regulating by itself. Not because I was trying to get rid of it, but just because change of attitude and a shift of attention. So noticing those feelings, it's a moment of mindfulness, but then in the moment, just bring your attention back to whatever it is that's going on around you that needs your attention. So it sounds simple, and it is, but it's not easy, especially with strong emotions. But anyway, there's a few tips, hopefully.
Yeah, no, that's great, Craig. There's also practice, isn't it? Sometimes you've got to put yourself in those situations as
Yeah.
well. It's as scary as they are. Could you comment about stress and mindfulness in relation to chronic disease or illnesses and the stress of coping with symptoms and potential future deterioration or flare-ups?
Yeah, well, one of the, if we're practicing mindfulness and the body is experiencing symptoms, could be pain, could be any other symptom for that matter. If the sensation's there, it's there, and mindfulness is not about trying to make it go away. But what often happens is the way we perceive things, if there's an experience of physical discomfort plus fear or anger or frustration or something else, then often it has an amplifying effect on our perception of that sensation. So that sort of sense of being able to be aware of the sensation, even if it's uncomfortable, but softening the attitude to it, means that it just comes back to the sensation it is. And we can experience so that the level to which we're bothered by that sensation diminishes. Or indeed, the same thing for the challenges we might be going through in life. And this is not necessarily always easy, but by just being present with them, addressing the step by step, they just come back to what they are without the elaboration and the amplification that often comes with what the mind does in response to those experiences. But one of the side effects from a chronic illness point of view is that stress puts a distortion on the body. It impairs the body's own natural capacity to heal itself, regeneration, etc. So taking some of that stress off the system allows the immune system to from going from dysregulation to re-regulate itself, reduce the inflammation, improve the defense. It helps the physiology to the brain to, it helps to take a lot of stress off the system. So it's a very useful thing for promoting healing. It's not so much that mindfulness does something magical to the system, more that it helps to settle some of that distorting effect that stress places over the system. So it helps the body to do what it knows how to do, but to do it better. So it helps us to cope, but it also helps with the illness itself as well.
Nearly out of time. I've got an interesting one here we might try and squeeze in from Greg. He's quite intrigued how different people respond to stressful situations. So you've got those that will run towards danger and others that run from danger. Are there any studies that's been done on the brain to see whether they're wired differently or not, or why that might be?
Well, it's a very hard study to do. If somebody is all of a sudden danger, to wheel out a functional MRI and put them in it and just to see what, it'd be great to do a study like that. But kind of what's sort of known about how the brain works in moments that are most mindful, and especially when you hear people's accounts of doing heroic things, they may not have even thought they did. But if you actually inquire into it, people are incredibly present in those situations, but paradoxically so present, they're aware of what's going on and responding to it, but the mind's not fast forwarding into the future. Oh, what if this or what if this? So there's this paradox of being very responsive and yet surprisingly calm at the same time. People step away and they don't feel like fantastic heroes or anything else. They just say, I just saw, I just respond, I just did what I needed to do in that situation. And it's kind of, these are almost like mindful moments of a very high order. And so sometimes people, like them, are all ordinary people, but we surprise ourselves with what we're capable of at certain times. And then we'll notice other times when there's a situation, but rather than leaning into it, the mind wants out. And sometimes that's the appropriate thing to do, is to get out of danger. But sometimes when there is a response, the mind wants to sort of flee when it needs to turn and confront that situation. Perhaps that's a little less mindful, but we can always learn. I can remember dealing with emergencies as a junior doctor. If you went into it, paid attention, engaged with it, you start to function better. If my mind was thinking, oh no, I don't want to be here, I found that all of a sudden it was much harder to sum up and make decisions, etc. It's a very different experience.
Good response. And
Well,
that's, I think, taken us to time, which
mm,
is where we're at. So thank you everyone for joining again. I've popped in the chat a link to next week's event with Kathy Freeman. And thank you, Luke and Craig, for your time today, and everyone that's joined us. So
thank
see
you
you
all.
all next
Thank you,
time.
Jess, and thank you, Luke.
Thank you.